I discovered my mother racked up $95,000 in fraudulent debt in my name to spend on online gambling. When confronted, she said I owed her for raising me. The worst part was finding out it wasn't the first time. The red envelope from the credit card company arrived on a sunny Tuesday morning. When I was making coffee before heading out for another exhausting day of work as a project manager at a tech company located in the city's business district, completely oblivious to the fact that this rectangular piece of letterhead paper containing just a few mechanically typed lines was about to detonate a nuclear bomb at the center of my carefully organized life during 39 years of existence, guided by obsessive financial responsibility, meticulous planning of every penny earned through decades of hard work climbing the corporate ladder, and especially by the comforting but completely illusory certainty that I knew deeply the most important people in my family life. I tore open the envelope with fingers still damp from the dishes I'd just washed, while waiting for the Italian coffee maker to finish whistling its characteristic sound, announcing that the dark, aromatic liquid was finally ready to be served in the white porcelain mug I used religiously every morning as part of a morning routine that psychologically anchored me before facing the chaotic traffic and endless meetings that dominated my weekdays at the company where I'd worked for over 12 consecutive years, building a solid reputation as a reliable and competent professional. What I read in those lines printed in impersonal corporate font was so completely unexpected and absurd that I had to reread it 3 consecutive times before my brain could minimally process the impossible meaning of those words that instantly transformed my peaceful morning into a potentially devastating financial nightmare. It was official notification about late payment on the monthly bill for a platinum credit card with a $45,000 limit, a card I absolutely did not possess, nor had applied for at any point in my adult life, characterized by systematically avoiding unnecessary debt and credit, as if they were modern plagues, capable of destroying financial foundations, built patiently over years of disciplined work and rigorous saving. My first instinctive reaction was to assume it was a grotesque bureaucratic error committed by the card company, or perhaps cybercrime fraud executed by criminals who had stolen my identity through data breaches so common in the digital age where personal information circulates freely in underground virtual markets, without victims having any knowledge about the extent of exposure of their sensitive data to malicious third parties. I grabbed my cell phone with hands that were already beginning to tremble slightly from the growing anxiety that always dominated me when confronted with financial situations beyond my absolute control, a personality trait that my ex-boyfriend Rodrigo used to gently mock during the 5 years of our relationship, before we amicably separated 2 years ago, over fundamental incompatibilities about future plans involving marriage and children that he intensely desired but that I honestly couldn't visualize as part of my life trajectory focused primarily on professional stability and financial independence. I dialed the customer service number printed in small letters at the bottom of the threatening notification, waiting impatiently through endless seconds of irritating electronic music, interspersed with recorded messages, informing me about the importance of my call, and requesting interminable patience, while all agents remained busy processing demands from other equally desperate customers, trying to resolve financial problems threatening their organized lives. After approximately 18 minutes of torturous waiting that made the coffee completely cool in the forgotten mug on the kitchen counter, while I nervously paced in circles around the small but comfortable apartment I'd bought with substantial sacrifice 3 years earlier, I was finally connected with an agent who mechanically identified herself as responsible for the card company's disputes and fraud department. I quickly explained my situation about receiving notification of late payment on a card I'd never applied for, expecting the agent to promptly confirm the obvious bureaucratic error and cancel that improper charge generating disproportionate anxiety, considering I maintained an impeccable credit score accumulated through decades of rigorously paying bills on time without ever delaying even a single bank slip. But instead of the reassuring confirmation I expected to hear, the agent asked me to wait a few moments while she consulted the company's internal systems, and when she finally returned to the call after a tense pause that lasted long enough to make my heart race in an irregular rhythm of growing anxiety, her words were pronounced with a neutral professional tone, but loaded with devastating implications that would completely transform my understanding of family trust, and especially of how far close people can go to exploit intimate relationships for selfish financial benefits. The agent informed me with bureaucratic coldness that the credit card in question had in fact been applied for in person in my name approximately 8 months ago at a physical branch of the company located in the city's commercial center, that all necessary documentation, including authenticated copies of my ID card and updated proof of residence had been duly presented during the approval process, as required by central bank regulations on fraud prevention and identity verification, and especially that the person who had appeared personally at the branch to apply for the card, presenting my original documents, was unmistakably a woman of approximately 60 years, identified on security cameras and in internal records as having declared herself to be my mother Vera, applying for an additional card in my name, claiming need to help her daughter who was going through temporary financial difficulties, but felt too embarrassed to personally request credit assistance. The impossible revelation that the agent had just delivered to me through that phone call instantly transformed my financial anxiety into something much more disturbing and emotionally complex, involving conflicting feelings of profound family betrayal, absolute disbelief about Vera's capacity to commit such deliberate and calculated fraud against her own daughter, and especially devastating confusion about possible motivations that would lead my biological mother to open a fraudulent credit account in my name, accumulating substantial debts that would inevitably destroy my credit score, meticulously built over years of exemplary financial behavior. My mind frantically tried to process that impossible information, while the agent continued explaining with limited professional patience that the card had been used intensively during the last 8 months to make large purchases at various commercial establishments, including department stores, expensive restaurants, travel agencies, and especially cash withdrawals totaling approximately $28,000 of the total $45,000 limit available on the fraudulent card. Every word she pronounced was like an additional hammer progressively beating against my skull, already aching from emotional and cognitive overload of trying to reconcile the image I maintained of Vera as an honest working mother who had raised me alone after traumatic divorce when I was only 7 years old, with this disturbing new reality of a woman capable of committing deliberate financial fraud against her own daughter, using maternal relationship as a tool to gain access to my personal documents, and especially to my naive trust about family integrity. When I finally hung up the phone after formally requesting that the agent email all documentation related to the fraudulent card, including copies of security camera footage showing Vera at the moment of in-person application and especially detailed statements of all transactions made during the last 8 months so I could begin formal contestation process and criminal complaint for documentary fraud, I felt as if the solid floor of my apartment had literally disappeared beneath my feet, leaving me floating in a void of emotional confusion, where all comforting certainties about family relationships had been instantly replaced by paralyzing distrust and obsessive questioning about how many other betrayals Vera might have committed during the 39 years of my existence that I had naively interpreted as expressions of maternal love, when they could have actually been calculated manipulations designed to maintain convenient access to my financial resources, and especially to my innocent trust. I looked around the apartment I had carefully furnished with pieces individually chosen over years, saving every penny to transform that modest space into a comfortable home reflecting my personality and especially my financial independence conquered through decades of hard work without depending on family assistance or favors from third parties that always left me uncomfortable due to the awkward feeling of being emotionally indebted to people who could eventually demand disproportionate returns for assistance provided. The devastating irony was that while I had spent my entire life obsessively avoiding financially depending on anyone to preserve my autonomy and dignity, Vera had been secretly depending on me fraudulently through a criminal scheme, cynically exploiting my identity and impeccable credit history to finance a lifestyle she clearly couldn't sustain with the modest retirement she received monthly as pension benefits after working 35 years as an administrative secretary in an accounting office. The decision about how to confront Vera about that devastating discovery was a question that kept me awake throughout the entire night following that traumatic call with the card company, obsessively alternating between different possible approaches while watching my bedroom ceiling through the silent darkness of sleepless early mornings that had become routine since discovering the maternal fraud. Part of me wanted to simply call Vera immediately and furiously scream through the phone all the accusations and feelings of betrayal boiling in my chest, oppressed by growing anxiety, confronting her directly about the crimes she'd committed against me, and demanding rational explanations for behavior so grotesquely manipulative and financially destructive. But another more cautious part of my normally analytical and strategic personality warned me that precipitous emotional confrontation could result in Vera simply denying everything, or worse still, trying to manipulate the narrative to present herself as victim of some desperate circumstance morally justifying her criminal actions, exploiting my residual filial guilt to avoid appropriate legal consequences for crimes she deliberately committed during 8 consecutive months while I remained completely ignorant about the systematic destruction of my credit reputation she was secretly orchestrating. I finally decided that before confronting Vera directly about the fraudulent card, I first needed to investigate the complete extent of financial damage she'd caused, and especially verify if this wasn't the first time she'd used my identity for criminal purposes, according to the disturbing implicit suggestion in the original notification that mentioned it was a second notice about late payment, suggesting that previous correspondence had been sent without my knowledge, possibly because Vera was somehow intercepting my bank correspondence in a way I hadn't yet fully identified. On the cold Thursday morning, following the initial discovery of the fraudulent card, I called my work informing them I needed to take an emergency day off for urgent personal matters that couldn't be postponed, and drove my compact car through the morning traffic less intense than usual to the Credit Protection Service central office, located in an austere commercial building in the city's financial district, where companies specializing in credit analysis maintained centralized operations, processing millions of daily queries about financial histories of citizens and businesses. The purpose of the in-person visit, instead of simply checking my score online through the convenient applications available free of charge, was to obtain a detailed and official report listing absolutely all credit inquiries made in my name during recent years, all accounts opened associated with my tax ID, and especially any record of debts or delays that might be silently staining my financial reputation without my conscious knowledge of their devastating existence. When I finally managed to be served by Mark, a 42-year-old manager with carefully combed brown hair and dark eyes demonstrating substantial experience dealing with desperate clients confronting traumatic financial discoveries, I briefly explained my situation about having discovered a fraudulent card opened in my name by a close family member, and my urgent need to verify if there were other similar frauds I hadn't yet detected through conventional credit monitoring channels I consulted occasionally but not obsessively, because I'd always naively trusted in the solidity of my financial reputation built through exemplary behavior. Mark nodded gravely, demonstrating empathetic understanding about family situations involving financial frauds perpetrated by close relatives who cynically exploit intimate trust and privileged access to personal documents to commit crimes that simultaneously destroy emotional relationships and financial stabilities of their naive victims. He quickly typed command sequences into the computer positioned on his organized desk, accessing internal systems that aggregated information from multiple financial and commercial institutions to compile a comprehensive credit profile that would reveal absolutely all financial activities officially registered in my name during a substantial retroactive period. What progressively appeared on the illuminated screen as Mark navigated through different sections of the detailed report was devastatingly worse than any scenario I'd imagined during my anxious speculations about possible extent of damage caused by Vera. In addition to the credit card I already knew about with a current outstanding balance of $45, including accumulated interest and late fees, there was also a record of a personal loan in the amount of $18, requested 6 months ago in my name, through a finance company specializing in credit for people with bad credit charging stratospheric interest rates characteristic of institutions operating at the legal limits of usury, vehicle financing for a used car in the amount of $32, made 4 months ago to purchase an automobile whose model and license plate I obviously didn't recognize because I'd never owned or even driven that specific vehicle. And especially, there was a sequence of credit inquiries made by multiple financial institutions during recent months suggesting Vera had tried to apply for additional credit in my name, at various establishments being probably rejected by most, due to the growing indebtedness she herself was systematically creating through previous frauds that progressively deteriorated my credit score, that had started impeccable but was now rapidly plummeting toward high risk categories that would prevent any legitimate credit application I might need to make in the future for genuine emergencies or investment opportunities requiring financing. The devastating magnitude of that discovery left me literally breathless, sitting in the synthetic leather chair in front of Mark's desk, while trying mentally to process the fact that my biological mother had been systematically destroying my financial reputation for at least 8 consecutive months through multiple coordinated frauds totaling approximately $95, in fraudulent debts accumulated in my name without my knowledge or consent, an amount representing almost 2 full years of my net salary as a project manager, and instantly transforming my financial situation from comfortable and stable to potentially catastrophic, in case creditor institutions decided to sue me legally for default, alleging I was legally responsible for those debts, regardless of having been a victim of family fraud. Mark observed my reaction of progressive shock with a compassionate but professional expression. Clearly, having witnessed similar scenes countless times during his career, dealing with victims of credit fraud, discovering devastating extents of financial damage caused by people who should have been trustworthy, but revealed themselves to be opportunistic predators cynically exploiting intimate relationships for selfish material benefits. When I finally managed to minimally recover my ability to articulate coherent thoughts into comprehensible words, I asked the obvious question tormenting my traumatized mind. How long would it take to completely clean my name from that devastating financial mess? And especially what legal measures I would need to take immediately to protect myself against additional consequences while formally processing all those frauds through appropriate official channels, involving criminal complaints against Vera, regardless of her being my biological mother who had raised me for 18 years before I conquered financial independence moving to my own apartment. Mark explained with professional patience that the process of contesting credit fraud was complex and time-consuming, requiring that I present a formal police report registered at a specialized precinct, documenting all crimes committed by Vera, obtain official declarations from all financial institutions involved, confirming transactions had been made fraudulently without my conscious participation, and especially submit all this compiled documentation to credit protection agencies for detailed analysis that could take between 3 and 6 months until resulting in complete removal of all fraudulent negative marks from my tax record. During that intermediate period of bureaucratic analysis, my credit score would remain severely compromised, preventing any legitimate credit application I might need to make, and especially I would face substantial risk of being sued legally by creditor institutions that had provided credit based on fraudulent but technically valid documentation presented by Vera during in-person applications she'd made passing herself off as me or claiming to be an authorized legal representative to act in my name. The legal complexity of that situation was overwhelming. But Mark was right about absolute necessity of acting immediately through appropriate official channels, instead of trying to resolve the matter privately through family confrontation that would probably result only in denials, emotional manipulations, and especially in giving Vera opportunity to destroy physical or digital evidence that could be crucial for future criminal proceedings designed to hold her legally accountable for crimes she'd deliberately committed against me during months of systematic fraudulent activity. I left the Credit Protection Service office carrying a thick envelope containing printed copies of my entire detailed credit history, showing each individual fraud officially documented with precise dates, exact amounts, and especially names of financial institutions that had been deceived by presentation of falsified documents or improper use of my identity by someone claiming to be my authorized legal representative. The physical weight of that envelope seemed symbolically disproportionate to the emotional and psychological weight of devastating revelations it contained, about complete extent of maternal betrayal that had been secretly occurring for months, while I maintained superficially normal relationship with Vera through weekly phone calls and monthly lunches where she never showed any sign of guilt or remorse about financial crimes she was systematically committing against me, cynically using maternal relationship as cover for elaborate fraudulent activities. My first stop after leaving the Credit Protection Service office was a specialized precinct for crimes against property located in an austere government building in the city's administrative center, where I spent 3 exhausting hours registering a detailed police report, reporting all discovered frauds and presenting compiled documentation as physical evidence of criminal activities perpetrated by Vera during substantial period without my conscious knowledge, or voluntary participation in fraudulent financial transactions that had been systematically made using my tax identity as tool to obtain credit. She clearly couldn't obtain based on her own modest financial situation as a retiree receiving limited pension benefits, insufficient to sustain the lifestyle suggested by purchases recorded in the statements. The investigator who attended to me at the precinct was a middle-aged man with tired expression, characteristic of professionals dealing daily with endless variations of financial crimes committed by people against family members, friends, romantic partners, and especially against vulnerable victims who naively trusted intimate relationships only to eventually discover they'd been systematically exploited by opportunistic predators, masked as trustworthy close persons. He made meticulous notes throughout my detailed account of progressive discovery of frauds from initial credit card notification to devastating revelations at Credit Protection Service about complete extent of accumulated financial damage, occasionally interrupting my narrative to ask specific technical questions about exact chronology, precise amounts, and especially about available evidence that could support formal criminal charges against Vera, including security camera records from financial institutions showing her applying for credit in person in my name, and copies of falsified or improperly used documents during credit. Approval processes that had been conducted according to apparently adequate regulations, but based on fraudulent premise that Vera had legal authorization to act in my name or that she was genuinely me presenting applications personally. When I finally officially signed the police report transforming all those disturbing discoveries into formal criminal case subject to police investigation and potential judicial proceedings against my own biological mother, I felt complex mixture of relief for finally taking concrete measures to protect myself legally and profound sadness about necessity of criminalizing person who had raised me during formative years of my childhood, even though that same person had deliberately chosen to betray me in such devastating ways during my adult life, when I'd finally conquered financial stability through decades of hard work and careful planning. The inevitable confrontation with Vera happened on the Sunday following police report registration, when I drove to the modest house where she lived alone since my sister Patricia had moved 5 years ago to live with her boyfriend in a neighboring city, approximately 60 miles away from the capital where I worked, and maintained my organized life far from family complications I'd always tried obsessively to avoid during my entire adult existence, guided by emotional and financial independence. The house was exactly as I remembered from my routine monthly visits. I maintained more from sense of filial obligation than genuine desire for maternal closeness. Well-kept front garden with colorful flowers, planted symmetrically along the stone path leading to the front door, painted light blue. Old but impeccably clean furniture Vera maintained with obsessive pride, characteristic of women of her generation who considered household cleanliness as direct expression of personal value and social respectability. I parked my compact car on the narrow street in front of the residence, breathed deeply several times, trying to control the accelerated heartbeats echoing in my ears like drums announcing imminent battle, and finally walked with deliberately slow steps through the rusty iron gate that creaked familiarly when opened, revealing sounds that had punctuated my entire childhood during the 18 years I lived in that house before finally conquering sufficient independence to move to my own apartment and establish healthy boundaries between my adult life and the maternal figure who'd always exercised excessive control over my personal choices through subtle emotional manipulations disguised as loving concern. When I rang the doorbell and heard the familiar electronic sound echoing through the walls of the house I intimately knew every inch of, I felt as if I was about to cross an irreversible threshold that would permanently transform the nature of our relationship from dysfunctional but tolerable family dynamic into open legal confrontation, involving police authorities, criminal proceedings, and especially definitive rupture of any pretense of family normalcy I still maintained from sense of residual filial duty. Vera opened the door after approximately 30 seconds that seemed like an eternity of growing anxiety, her thin, 63-year-old figure framed by the dark wooden molding of the main entrance. Wearing a light blue household robe she habitually used on Sundays when not expecting formal visitors, gray hair cut short, impeccably styled even in the casual context of the weekend, and especially those calculating green eyes that had always made me uncomfortable during important conversations, because they seemed constantly to evaluate and judge every word I pronounced, seeking vulnerabilities that could be exploited later in future discussions about life choices she silently disapproved, but communicated through subtle facial expressions and apparently innocent comments loaded with implicit criticisms. Her initial expression of mild surprise seeing me standing in the doorway on a Sunday morning without prior notice quickly transformed into something I interpreted as growing caution, when she probably perceived from my tense body posture and serious facial expression that this was not casual social visit, but rather planned confrontation about grave matter I'd been postponing throughout the entire week since discovery of frauds at Credit Protection Service. We remained in uncomfortable silence for a few seconds, staring at each other through the liminal space of the house entrance, while invisible currents of family tension accumulated over decades of complicated relationship materialized almost physically in the humid morning air, threatening imminent rain, perfectly reflecting heavy emotional atmosphere, hanging between us like toxic cloud about to explode into devastating storm. Finally, Vera broke the tense silence with controlled but clearly curious voice about motivation for that unexpected visit, obviously interrupting her quiet Sunday routine of prolonged coffee and morning television programs she religiously watched every week as ritual of comfortable solitude she'd established since my father had died, leaving her a widow facing aging alone without romantic partner to share final decades of existence, progressively limited by natural physical ailments and voluntary social isolation, characteristic of elderly people who gradually lose social circles as friends die or move to other cities. following adult children establishing their own lives far from aging parents. Carolina, what a surprise to see you here on a Sunday morning without calling ahead. Usually you call during the week to arrange the time of our monthly visits I keep marked on the kitchen calendar as important appointments organizing my solitary routine, she said with tone mixing genuine surprise and growing caution about nature of that unscheduled visit, clearly deviating from patterns established over years of predictable and emotionally controlled interactions, characterizing our functional but distant relationship. I didn't respond immediately because I was trying to mentally organize a sequence of devastating accusations I needed to present clearly, and especially irreversibly leaving no room for emotional manipulations or attempts to deflect responsibility through dramatic tears or sentimental appeals about maternal sacrifices Vera used to strategically invoke during difficult discussions about financial matters or personal choices. She disapproved, but couldn't directly control. Due to my economic independence conquered through decades of hard work building solid professional career that freed me from material dependence on family that had always used financial resources as tool of emotional control over more vulnerable members. I gently pushed the open door, walking deliberately inside the house without waiting for explicit invitation. My physical invasion of her domestic space implicitly communicating absolute seriousness of that confrontation that wouldn't be conducted civilly at the residence entrance where curious neighbors could hear devastating accusations about financial crimes systematically committed. During months of fraudulent activity that completely destroyed my credit reputation, and especially my residual trust in the integrity of person who should have been protective maternal figure, instead of opportunistic predator, cynically exploiting family relationship for selfish material benefits. Vera closed the door behind me with slow movement, demonstrating growing hesitation about imminent confrontation she'd probably anticipated eventually since the moment she began committing frauds using my identity, but hoped to postpone indefinitely through planned denials and elaborate emotional manipulations that historically worked in our previous family conflicts involving less serious matters than fraudulent debts totaling almost $100. €0 accumulated secretly over months of systematic criminal activity. I walked directly to the modestly furnished living room with faded floral fabric sofa, where we'd maintained countless superficial conversations during routine monthly visits. I fulfilled religiously more from sense of moral obligation than genuine desire for emotional closeness with woman who'd always made me feel inadequate through veiled criticisms about professional choices focused on career instead of marriage and motherhood. She considered appropriate natural destinies for women regardless of personal ambitions or individual talents that could direct lives through different paths than those traditionally prescribed by conservative social norms of her generation. I remained standing instead of sitting, because upright posture communicated authority, and especially irrevocable determination, to conduct that confrontation on my own terms, without allowing Vera to assume control through false domestic hospitality that would transform serious accusations into friendly family conversation, where she could manipulate narrative presenting herself as victim of desperate circumstances, morally justifying crimes she'd deliberately committed against her own daughter, using maternal relationship as cover for elaborate fraudulent activities. I removed the thick envelope from the large bag I was carrying, containing all evidence compiled during the previous week. Copies of detailed credit protection service report showing each individual fraud officially documented with precise dates and exact amounts, bank statements from multiple financial institutions where Vera had applied for fraudulent credit in my name, photographs captured from security cameras showing her in person at bank branches during credit approval processes, and especially a copy of the official police report I'd formally registered at the specialized precinct, transforming those disturbing discoveries into criminal case subject to police investigation and potential judicial proceedings that could result in prison and permanent criminal record that would mark the rest of her existence as convicted criminal for frauds against her own family. I placed the heavy envelope on the coffee table, strategically positioned between us, creating symbolic physical barrier, representing emotional and legal abyss, now definitively separating mother and daughter, transforming dysfunctional but tolerable family relationship into adversarial situation, involving government authorities and potentially criminal courts, where impartial judges would decide appropriate consequences for crimes systematically committed during months of deliberate fraudulent activity. Vera looked at the envelope with expression I interpreted as complex mixture of growing curiosity and nascent fear about content of those official documents, obviously representing substantial evidence meticulously compiled to support serious accusations I was about to formally present, destroying any possibility of plausible denial or emotional manipulation that could deflect legal responsibility for financial crimes she'd committed, systematically using my tax identity as tool to obtain fraudulent credit financing, unsustainable lifestyle based on illegally obtained resources through cynical exploitation of family trust and privileged access to personal documents I'd naively allowed her to keep stored in house drawers for years, when I still lived there before conquering sufficient independence to establish my own residence far from excessive maternal control. Vera, I came here today because I discovered something absolutely devastating during last week that completely transformed my understanding of who you really are as a person, and especially of how far you're willing to go to exploit maternal relationship for selfish financial benefits, systematically destroying your own daughter's life through crimes that could result in my imprisonment, and complete destruction of professional reputation patiently built during decades of honest work. I began with controlled voice, but clearly loaded with contained fury, threatening to explode into emotional accusations if I didn't maintain disciplined focus on factual presentation of irrefutable evidence, instead of allowing feelings of family betrayal to dominate me, transforming necessary confrontation into unproductive emotional drama, giving Vera opportunity to manipulate narrative through strategic tears and sentimental appeals about maternal sacrifices. Her expression subtly changed from cautious curiosity to something resembling nascent defense, while facial muscles visibly tensed, preparing psychological posture to deny accusations or alternatively present elaborate justifications, minimizing gravity of criminal actions, transforming them into understandable mistakes committed under pressure of desperate financial circumstances any reasonable person could commit if facing similar situations of urgent material need, combined with convenient opportunities to access credit through identity of close relative maintaining impeccable credit score built through exemplary financial behavior. I methodically opened the envelope, first removing the detailed Credit Protection Service report listing all officially documented frauds, and began reading aloud each individual item, starting with the Platinum credit card with $45. 000 limit I'd initially discovered through threatening notification received the previous Tuesday, initiating that entire devastating investigation about complete extent of financial damage caused by person who should have been trustworthy, but revealed herself to be an opportunistic predator. Credit card applied for 8 months ago in my name, presenting falsified documentation, including copies of my ID card and proof of residence, used intensively for purchases totaling $45, $0, including expensive restaurants, department stores, travel agencies, and especially cash withdrawals you obviously used to finance a lifestyle you couldn't sustain with the modest retirement you receive monthly as pension benefits. I read directly from the official document while observing Vera's expression progressively transforming from cautious defense to something resembling growing panic as she realized I possessed detailed evidence and especially official documentation, making denials implausible, and emotional manipulations, ineffective against irrefutable facts, compiled by financial institutions through computerized systems, meticulously recording every fraudulent transaction made using my identity during months of systematic criminal activity. I continued methodically reading through the devastating list of additional frauds discovered at Credit Protection Service. Personal loan of $18,000 obtained through finance company specializing in credit for people with bad credit charging stratospheric interest rates, used vehicle financing in amount of $32,000 to purchase automobile I obviously never owned or drove, and especially sequence of credit inquiries made by multiple financial institutions suggesting failed attempts to apply for additional credit at various establishments, probably rejecting applications due to growing indebtedness. Vera herself was systematically creating through previous frauds, progressively deteriorating my credit score, transforming impeccable financial reputation into high risk profile characteristic of people involved in criminal activities or minimally financially irresponsible. When I finally finished complete reading of all frauds officially documented in Credit Protection Service report, I placed that document back on coffee table and grabbed next item from envelope. Copy of official police report I'd formally registered at specialized precinct, transforming those devastating discoveries into criminal case subject to immediate police investigation. I held that government document stamped with official seals before Vera's eyes, forcing her to confront irreversible legal reality that her criminal actions had crossed boundary from private family matter that could be resolved through domestic conversations and transformed into criminal justice case, involving police authorities now possessing legal mandate to investigate, arrest, and judicially prosecute person responsible for documented frauds, regardless of family relationship between victim and criminal. The expression on Vera's face when she finally completely understood irreversible gravity of legal situation she'd placed herself in through months of deliberate fraudulent activity was dramatic transformation from calculated defense to something I can only describe as absolute. Desperation mixed with growing panic as complete implications of that confrontation progressively settled in her consciousness. Revealing habitual emotional manipulation strategies wouldn't work against officially documented evidence, and especially against legal processes already formally initiated through appropriate government channels that would follow inevitable bureaucratic course regardless of tears or sentimental appeals about family relationships or historical maternal sacrifices. Carolina, let me explain. You don't understand complete circumstances that led me to make desperate decisions during recent months. I was facing impossible financial situation with accumulated debts threatening to take the house where I lived for decades, raising you and your sister after your father abandoned us, leaving me alone to support entire family with modest salary as administrative secretary. Vera began, with voice trying to sound desperate and victimized, but to me, communicating only calculated emotional manipulation, attempting to deflect personal responsibility for crimes she deliberately committed, presenting herself as victim of adverse circumstances instead of criminal who made conscious choices to defraud her own daughter, instead of seeking legitimate solutions to financial problems as any honest person would when facing material difficulties. I immediately interrupted that attempt to manipulate narrative through victimized story about financial difficulties and historical maternal sacrifices completely irrelevant to central legal question about crimes systematically committed for months, deliberately using my identity to obtain fraudulent credit, destroying my financial reputation, and putting my freedom at risk through potential incrimination in money laundering or tax evasion crimes I hadn't consciously committed. I raised my hand in authoritative stop gesture, clearly communicating I wouldn't allow interruptions or narrative deviations, while formally presenting all accusations and especially irreversible legal consequences she'd face due to criminal choices she'd made during prolonged period of deliberate fraudulent activity against her own family. Vera, I won't allow you to manipulate this conversation presenting yourself as victim of desperate financial circumstances when officially documented reality is you committed multiple serious federal crimes for at least 8 consecutive months, including documentary fraud, improper use of another's identity, qualified swindle involving multiple financial institutions, and especially deliberate construction of criminal profile associated with my tax identity that could result in my imprisonment for crimes I didn't commit. I declared with unwavering firmness, communicating absolute determination not to accept justifications or emotional manipulations minimizing gravity of criminal actions through victimized narratives about financial difficulties. I continued systematically presenting all compiled evidence, including photographs captured from bank security cameras, unequivocally showing Vera in person at branches during fraudulent credit applications, detailed statements of all transactions made using cards and loans illegally obtained in my name, and especially technical analysis provided by Mark from Credit Protection Service explaining how systematic pattern of fraud suggested deliberate planning instead of isolated error committed under pressure of urgent financial need. Each additional evidence I presented was like a hammer progressively beating against Vera's psychological defenses, systematically destroying any possibility of denying responsibility or morally justifying crimes she'd committed through elaborate narratives about maternal sacrifices or mitigating circumstances that could minimize gravity of deliberate criminal actions. The transformation in Vera's facial expression and body posture as I systematically presented all compiled evidence was dramatic progression from initial calculated defense through desperate denial until finally emotional collapse when she completely realized there was no possible escape from irreversible legal consequences she'd face due to criminal choices she'd made during months of systematic fraudulent activity. Tears finally began flowing from her eyes as she apparently comprehended complete magnitude of damage she'd caused not only to my financial situation, but especially to maternal relationship now irreparably destroyed through betrayal so profound and calculated making. Impossible any future reconciliation based on restored trust or genuine forgiveness beyond superficial formalities, maintained from sense of social obligation during inevitable family events like weddings or funerals of shared relatives. When she finally tried speaking again after several minutes of heavy silence punctuated only by intermittent sobs, her voice had broken and desperate quality, dramatically contrasting with controlled and manipulative tone, characterizing beginning of that confrontation before irrefutable evidence completely destroyed her psychological defenses built in advance for that inevitable conversation she'd probably mentally rehearsed multiple times. hoping to manipulate narrative through emotional appeals about family relationships and historical sacrifices, morally justifying crimes committed against ungrateful daughter, supposedly not adequately appreciating everything dedicated mother had sacrificed during decades raising two daughters alone after traumatic divorce. Carolina, please, you need to understand I never really wanted to harm you. I was simply desperate trying to keep the house and pay debts accumulated during years of financial solitude after your father abandoned us, leaving only miserable alimony, barely covering basic expenses while you two were growing up requiring clothes, school supplies, extracurricular activities. I provided, sacrificing my own needs to ensure you had better opportunities than I had when I was young without adequate education or family support. Vera again tried manipulating narrative, presenting victimized version of family history, emphasizing maternal sacrifices while conveniently minimizing fact that crimes she'd committed were deliberate and conscious choices, instead of accidental errors or decisions forced by circumstances completely beyond personal control. But this time, her attempted emotional manipulation was met not with residual filial guilt she probably expected to invoke through reminders about historical sacrifices, but rather with cold fury and unwavering determination, fueled by months of devastating anxiety since initial discovery of frauds, and especially by growing comprehension about complete extent of calculated betrayal perpetrated systematically during prolonged period, while I naively maintained residual trust in basic integrity of person who should have been protective maternal figure. I responded with controlled voice but loaded with growing contempt, clearly communicating maternal relationship was definitively terminated beyond any possibility of genuine reconciliation based on restored trust or authentic forgiveness, transcending superficial formalities maintained only from inevitable social obligations. Vera, you had countless legitimate options available if you really were facing serious financial difficulties. You could have asked for help directly requesting loan. I probably would have provided establishing reasonable payment terms. You could have sought professional financial counseling to restructure debts through negotiations with creditors. You could even have considered selling house too large for single person and moving to smaller apartment, more suitable for retiree living alone with limited income. I systematically enumerated legitimate alternatives any honest person would have explored before resorting to financial crimes against own family. But instead of any of those legal and morally acceptable options, you deliberately chose to commit systematic frauds using my identity for at least 8 consecutive months, accumulating debts totaling almost $100,000 that completely destroyed my credit reputation patiently built during decades of exemplary financial behavior, and especially putting me at risk of being criminally prosecuted for money laundering or tax evasion due to suspicious profile you built associated with my identity through multiple fraudulent transactions made at different banks, following patterns suggesting organized criminal activity instead of simple temporary financial difficulty. Every word I pronounced was like judicial sentence being formally delivered, communicating irreversibility of legal consequences Vera would face due to criminal choices she'd consciously made during months of systematic fraudulent activity against own daughter who'd always maintained respectful relationship even when disagreeing with maternal choices or feeling excessively controlled through subtle emotional manipulations disguised as appropriate loving concern of dedicated mother. The next phase of that devastating confrontation involved final and most disturbing revelation about real motivations behind systematic frauds. Direct question about where exactly was all money fraudulently obtained through those credit cards, personal loans, and financing totaling almost $100. $0 accumulated during 8 months of deliberate criminal activity. I carefully observed Vera's facial expression when I asked that crucial question, expecting to detect signs of additional lying or attempt to conceal information about final destination of illegally obtained resources that could reveal additional layers of criminality beyond frauds officially documented at Credit Protection Service and formally registered in police report. There was significant pause before she responded, during which I observed visible internal conflict in her eyes, quickly calculating whether she should continue lying, trying to minimize complete extent of criminal activities, or should finally confess complete truth, recognizing already compiled evidence made additional denials implausible and especially counterproductive in terms of potential to negotiate judicial agreement, minimizing legal consequences through cooperation with police investigations and demonstration of genuine remorse instead of maintaining defensive posture based on denials and elaborate justifications. Finally, she responded with low and defeated voice, dramatically contrasting with initial manipulative tone of that confrontation, revealing information confirming worse suspicions about calculated and deliberate nature of crimes she'd systematically committed for months, cynically exploiting family relationship for selfish material benefits, financing unsustainable lifestyle based on fraudulently obtained resources. I used money to pay old debts accumulated over years. Gambling at online casinos I discovered approximately 2 years ago when I was seeking ways to relieve loneliness and boredom of retirement. Living alone without clear purpose or meaningful social connections filling. Emotional void left by decades of hard work and maternal sacrifices. Not adequately appreciated by daughters who abandoned me as soon as they conquered financial independence. Establishing their own lives, far from aging mother who dedicated entire existence, raising them alone after traumatic divorce. Vera finally confessed, revealing additional disturbing dimension of her situation, partially explaining but absolutely not morally justifying crimes she'd committed against me. The revelation about addiction to online gambling transformed narrative from desperate mother facing inevitable financial difficulties into much darker story about person with dependency problem who chose to finance destructive addiction through systematic frauds against own family instead of seeking appropriate treatment for psychological condition, requiring professional intervention and especially personal accountability, instead of manipulative victimization, deflecting culpability to external circumstances or others' failures to provide sufficient emotional support, preventing development of self-destructive behaviors. I felt wave of conflicting emotions processing that confession. On one hand, there was element of understanding about how chronic loneliness and lack of purpose during retirement can lead vulnerable people to develop destructive dependencies, seeking escapism through activities providing temporary excitement, masking deeper emotional voids. But on other hand, remained absolute fury about fact Vera had consciously chosen to finance her addiction through crimes against me instead of seeking professional help or minimally confessing problem requesting family support, probably would have been provided establishing appropriate conditions, including mandatory treatment for dependency and financial supervision, preventing additional damage. We remained in tense silence for several minutes after that devastating confession about gambling addiction, explaining real motivation behind systematic frauds, each internally processing complete implications of that revelation about nature of maternal relationship fundamentally based on manipulations and concealments, instead of honesty and mutual trust characterizing healthy functional families. I finally broke oppressive silence with final declaration about irreversible consequences Vera would face due to criminal choices she'd consciously made during months of systematic fraudulent activity financing, destructive addiction through cynical exploitation of family relationship, and especially of my tax identity, now permanently stained by fraudulent debts accumulated in my name without conscious knowledge or consent. I methodically explained next steps of legal process already formally initiated through police report registration. Criminal investigation to be conducted by authorities specialized in financial frauds, including forensic analysis of all officially documented transactions. Potential issuance of preventive arrest warrant. If investigators determined there was risk of flight or destruction of additional evidence. Formal judicial proceedings inevitably resulting in criminal conviction, considering overwhelming volume of officially documented evidence through computerized banking systems, meticulously recording each individual fraud during prolonged period. And especially sentence probably including effective imprisonment, depending on severity determined by judge considering multiple federal crimes systematically committed, demonstrating deliberate planning instead of isolated error resulting from temporary urgent need. The expression on Vera's face when she finally completely understood irreversibility of legal consequences she'd face was transformation from desperation into defeated resignation, characteristic of person finally accepting responsibility for destructive choices after exhausting all attempts to manipulate narrative or deflect culpability to external factors beyond personal control. She asked with small and broken voice if there was any possibility of me withdrawing criminal complaint, allowing private resolution through family agreement, avoiding public scandal and especially prison that would completely destroy rest of her existence, transforming respectable retiree into convicted criminal carrying permanent record marking all future interaction with government institutions and society in general. I responded with unwavering firmness that decision to register official police report wasn't made impulsively, but rather after detailed consultation with specialized attorneys who clearly explained only way to legally protect myself against potential incrimination in financial crimes I didn't commit was to formally establish through official channels that I was fraud victim instead of voluntary participant in criminal schemes. and therefore police complaint was irreversible and would follow inevitable legal course regardless of belated remorse or emotional appeals about family relationships irreparably destroyed through calculated betrayals, systematically perpetrated during months of deliberate fraudulent activity. I also informed that in addition to criminal proceedings conducted by police authorities, I was simultaneously initiating civil action seeking financial reparations for substantial moral damages caused through months of devastating anxiety since discovery of frauds, and especially for complete destruction of credit reputation, patiently built during decades, now requiring long and costly formal contestation process through multiple bureaucratic channels to eventually clean my name from fraudulent negative marks permanently staining my tax history. The final confrontation ended with my departure from house, leaving Vera alone processing complete magnitude of consequences she'd face due to criminal choices she'd consciously made financing destructive gambling addiction through systematic frauds against own daughter who'd always maintained respectful relationship, even when feeling emotionally manipulated or excessively controlled through subtle tactics disguised as appropriate maternal concern. I walked through familiar front garden for last time, as visiting daughter returning to reality of being formal victim of financial crimes, perpetrated by person who should have been trustworthy, but revealed herself to be opportunistic predator, cynically exploiting intimate relationships for selfish material benefits. I entered compact car parked on narrow street, and slowly drove away from that house that had been home during 18 formative years, but now represented only location of crimes systematically committed against me for months, while I naively maintained residual trust and basic integrity of maternal figure. During drive back to my apartment through still empty streets of cloudy Sunday morning, I internally processed all conflicting emotions about necessary but devastating confrontation, relief for finally having directly faced Vera presenting irrefutable evidence, making denials implausible, profound sadness about irreversible destruction of family relationship, never ideal but maintaining functional appearance through routine monthly visits and superficial conversations, avoiding controversial topics, and especially renewed determination to follow legal process to final conclusion, regardless of family pressures or emotional appeals about forgiveness and reconciliation, inevitably coming from well-intentioned but misinformed relatives about complete extent of calculated betrayals systematically perpetrated during months of deliberate criminal activity. The weeks following that devastating confrontation with Vera transformed into a period of intense emotional and bureaucratic turbulence, where each day brought new developments in criminal case I'd formally initiated through police report registration at precinct specialized in crimes against property. Rodrigo, my ex-boyfriend lawyer who'd kindly offered to represent me legally, despite complicated matrimonial history between us, worked tirelessly compiling comprehensive dossier, documenting not only financial frauds systematically committed by Vera during 8 consecutive months, but especially establishing detailed chronology, clearly demonstrating my complete ignorance about criminal activities until moment of accidental discovery through that red notification from credit card company arriving on sunny Tuesday, permanently transforming my understanding of family trust and limits of maternal betrayal. During our weekly meetings at his office located in modern corporate building in city's financial center, Rodrigo patiently explained legal complexities of case involving multiple jurisdictions due to frauds having been committed at different financial institutions located in diverse neighborhoods, and especially about defensive strategies we needed to implement preventively in case Vera tried reversing narrative, alleging I'd tacitly consented to use of my identity, or had directly or indirectly benefited from resources fraudulently obtained through those loans and credit cards illegally applied for using my personal documents. The disturbing possibility Vera could try incriminating me as voluntary accomplice instead of innocent victim of systematic frauds kept me awake during endless nights obsessively processing every historical interaction we'd maintained during preceding years, trying to identify moments where she could falsely allege I'd demonstrated knowledge about her criminal activities or provided implicit assistance through deliberate negligence in monitoring my credit history frequently enough to detect frauds in early stages when damage was still minimally reversible. The first preliminary judicial hearing happened on cold September morning, approximately 6 weeks after initial police report registration, when I was formally summoned to appear at city's central courthouse, accompanied by Rodrigo to present detailed testimony before judge specialized in financial crimes about circumstances of fraud, discovery, and especially about nature of my historical relationship with Vera that could contextualize possible motivations for her having specifically chosen to victimize me instead of seeking other alternatives to finance destructive online gambling addiction she'd revealed during our traumatic domestic confrontation. The courtroom was austere environment with gray walls decorated only with national coat of arms and official photograph of Republic's president, furnished with dark polished wooden benches, where family members of defendants and victims nervously awaited their turns to be called, before judicial authorities deciding destinies through formal sentences based on technical interpretations of complex legal codes most ordinary people didn't adequately understand without assistance from specialized attorneys. When I was finally called to sit in witness chair, strategically positioned facing judge and public prosecutor, but laterally relative to Vera, sitting beside her public defender assigned by state because she obviously didn't possess financial resources to hire private legal representation, I felt crushing weight of that impossible situation where I was being forced to formally testify against own biological mother in criminal proceedings, potentially resulting in her effective imprisonment for crimes she deliberately committed against me during months of systematic fraudulent activity. Seeing Vera in that formal court context wearing simple clothes dramatically contrasting with casual elegance she used to maintain during our routine monthly visits, her face visibly aged by stress of facing irreversible legal consequences of criminal choices, and especially those green eyes that had always been calculating now, demonstrating only defeated resignation of person, finally accepting responsibility for destructive actions after exhausting all attempts to manipulate narrative or deflect culpability to external factors, created complex mixture of conflicting emotions simultaneously, including satisfaction for finally obtaining appropriate legal justice and profound sadness about irreversible destruction of family relationship, despite never being ideal, still representing significant emotional connection with person who'd raised me during formative childhood years. The testimony I provided during that first judicial hearing lasted approximately 2.5 hours, including direct interrogation conducted by Rodrigo, establishing factual chronology of progressive discoveries from initial credit card notification to devastating revelations at Credit Protection Service, followed by cross-examination conducted by Vera's public defender, attempting to establish I'd deliberately neglected adequate monitoring of my credit history, creating opportunities facilitating frauds instead of implementing reasonable protective safeguards would have detected suspicious activities in much earlier stages when damage was still substantially smaller and especially reversible through simple administrative contestations, instead of formal criminal proceedings involving police authorities and judicial courts. During that uncomfortable cross-examination, where Vera's public defender asked technical questions about frequency, I consulted my credit score and especially about why I'd allowed Vera to keep copies of my personal documents stored in her house drawers for years when I still lived there before moving to own apartment. I maintained professional composure, honestly responding that, like most people, maintaining exemplary financial behavior, paying bills rigorously on time, I didn't see need to obsessively monitor my credit history, consulting it weekly or monthly, because I reasonably trusted impeccable reputation built during decades wasn't being secretly destroyed by person who should be trustworthy, but revealed herself to be opportunistic predator, cynically exploiting family relationship for selfish material benefits. The judge presiding that preliminary hearing was woman of approximately 55 years, with severe facial expression characteristic of judicial professionals developing substantial skepticism about human nature, after decades witnessing endless variations of crimes committed by people against family members, friends, and especially against vulnerable victims naively trusting intimate relationships, only to eventually discover they'd been systematically exploited through elaborate manipulations, disguised as normal behaviors of close people. After completion of testimonies and presentation of all documentary evidence meticulously compiled by Rodrigo, including complete Credit Protection Service report, detailed bank statements from all financial institutions involved in frauds, photographs captured from security cameras unequivocally showing Vera applying for credit in person at bank branches during approval process, and especially graphological analyses confirming signatures on fraudulent documents were authentically hers, instead of forgeries executed by unknown third parties. Judge announced she'd carefully deliberate about case during period of approximately 3 weeks before issuing preliminary decision about whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed with formal criminal proceedings against Vera, or case should be archived for evidential insufficiency as argued by her public defender, alleging frauds could have been committed by professional criminals who stole identity of both me and Vera, using falsified documents of both to execute elaborate scheme without conscious knowledge or participation of either of us. That legal possibility case could be archived for alleged evidence insufficiency, despite overwhelming volume of compiled official documentation, left me simultaneously furious about potential injustice of legal system, sometimes allowing criminals to escape appropriate consequences through procedural technicalities skillfully exploited by defense attorneys. And especially anxious about possibility of having gone through months of devastating emotional turbulence processing traumatic discoveries about complete extent of maternal betrayals, only to finally not obtain adequate legal justice, formally holding Vera accountable for crimes she deliberately committed during prolonged period of systematic fraudulent activity against own daughter, always maintaining respectful relationship, even when feeling emotionally manipulated or excessively controlled. During that 3-week period awaiting preliminary judicial decision, daily life became exercise of anxiety, managed through obsessively structured routines, helping me maintain appearance of professional functionality at work, where colleagues obviously perceived something serious was disturbing my habitual concentration, but respected my privacy, avoiding direct questions about nature of personal problems clearly dominating my mental attention, even during important meetings or client presentations, requiring absolute focus on complex technical issues related to technology projects. I managed as primary responsibility of my corporate position. Patricia, my older sister living in neighboring city approximately 60 miles away, called frequently during that period, offering emotional support, and especially sharing her own confusion about how to process devastating revelations about Vera's real nature. We'd both naively interpreted during decades as honest working mother, sacrificing personal comforts to raise 2 daughters alone after traumatic divorce when we were dependent children needing constant maternal care. During one of those long phone conversations on particularly sleepless night when anxiety about imminent judicial decision completely prevented me from sleeping, Patricia revealed disturbing information adding extra layer of complexity to family narrative we thought we completely knew, approximately 3 years before frauds against me began. Vera had apparently tried applying for personal loan using Patricia's identity, but was prevented because specific financial institution had recently implemented additional verification protocol requiring live video conference with applicant during approval process. And when bank employee tried scheduling that video call, Vera invented excuse about technical problems with internet and simply abandoned fraud attempt instead of risking being definitively identified as different person from whose documents she was fraudulently presenting. Patricia's revelation about previous fraud attempt against her completely transformed case nature, from isolated incident resulting from temporary desperate circumstances into systematic pattern of criminal behavior, specifically directed against own daughters. Vera apparently considered convenient financial resources to be exploited through frauds instead of real people with own lives, devastated by destruction of credit reputations, patiently built through decades of exemplary financial behavior. I immediately informed Rodrigo about that disturbing revelation, and he promptly contacted Patricia, requesting she provide formal testimony, documenting frustrated previous fraud attempt, obtain official declaration from involved financial institution, confirming loan application was initiated using her identity but abandoned before completion of approval process. And especially that she consider registering additional police report establishing Vera had committed crimes not only against me, but also against both daughters, demonstrating systematic criminal pattern instead of isolated moral lapse resulting from temporary urgent financial need, as alleged by her public defender, attempting to minimize action gravity through victimized narrative about desperate retiree facing chronic loneliness and material difficulties after decades of maternal sacrifices not adequately appreciated by ungrateful daughters. Patricia's decision to also formalize criminal complaint against Vera, despite fraud attempt against her being frustrated before causing real financial damage, was defining moment communicating family solidarity between sisters, recognizing we'd both been victimized by person who should have been maternal protector, but revealed herself to be opportunistic predator, coldly calculating how to exploit intimate family relationships for selfish material benefits, financing destructive gambling addiction, instead of seeking appropriate treatment for psychological dependency, requiring professional intervention. The preliminary judicial decision finally arrived on rainy October afternoon through official notification sent by email to Rodrigo, informing judge had determined substantial sufficient evidence existed to proceed with formal criminal proceedings against Vera for multiple crimes including qualified documentary fraud involving systematic use of another's identity for criminal purposes, swindle characterized by obtaining credit through deliberate deception of financial institutions, and especially formation of organized criminal activity profile based on pattern of multiple coordinated frauds executed during prolonged period demonstrating deliberate planning instead of isolated error committed under urgent need pressure. Judicial decision also established Vera would be subjected to precautionary measures, including prohibition from applying for any type of credit using own or another's identity during criminal proceedings period, obligation to appear monthly before judicial authorities to confirm residential address and especially demonstrate she wasn't attempting to flee jurisdiction to avoid trial, and preventive suspension of her retirement as administrative secretary because pension benefit was being partially used to pay private defense attorney she'd hired after perceiving initially assigned public defender didn't possess sufficient experience in complex family fraud cases to develop adequate defensive strategy, minimizing potential sentence through negotiated agreements with public prosecution. News case was officially proceeding to formal trial brought complex mixture of relief for judicial validation. My accusations were based on substantial evidence instead of simply exaggerated interpretations of ambiguous behaviors, and especially renewed anxiety about long and emotionally exhausting process still ahead, including multiple additional hearings. Possibility of jury trial if Vera chose not to accept negotiated agreement with prosecution, and especially need to repeatedly relive traumas related to fraud discoveries each time I was summoned to provide testimonies or answer interrogations conducted by defense attorneys attempting to discredit my narrative through technical questioning about specific details I might not perfectly remember due to time passage since original events. Negotiations for judicial agreement began approximately 2 months after preliminary decision authorizing criminal proceedings continuation. When Vera's private defense attorney finally recognized overwhelming volume of officially documented evidence, made impossible mounting credible defense based on responsibility denial, or allegation frauds had been committed by unknown third parties using falsified identities of both her and me. During meeting mediated by public prosecutor specialized in crimes against property, agreement proposals were presented including Vera formally declaring herself guilty of all documented crimes in exchange for reduced sentence replacing effective imprisonment with semi-open regime with electronic monitoring, allowing her to remain residing in own house, but subject to severe movement restrictions, and especially obligation to participate in treatment program for gambling dependency, supervised by psychologists specialized in destructive behavioral addictions. Agreement proposal also included clause establishing financial restitution plan, where Vera would be obligated to pay monthly fixed percentage of her retirement, destined to partially compensate financial damages caused through systematic frauds. Although both Rodrigo and I realistically recognized considering her modest retirement, and especially advanced age making unlikely she'd live long enough to completely reimburse almost $100,000 fraudulently accumulated during 8 months of intensive criminal activity, those monthly payments were more symbolic, representing formal acknowledgement of responsibility, than practical solution, actually compensating substantial material damages caused to my financial situation. Decision about accepting or rejecting that agreement proposal was complex moral dilemma, keeping me awake during several consecutive nights weighing alternatives between accepting relatively lenient sentence, at least formally establishing Vera's culpability through official, judicial confession versus insisting on complete jury trial, potentially resulting in more severe sentence, including effective imprisonment, but also risking possibility of unexpected acquittal if jurors sympathized with victimized narrative about desperate elderly retiree committing crimes from necessity instead of deliberate malice. I finally decided to accept judicial agreement proposal, primarily because long jury trial process would require additional months of emotional turbulence, including need to publicly testify before strangers about intimate details of dysfunctional family relationship, and especially because sentence including mandatory treatment for gambling dependency at least offered possibility, Vera eventually received professional help, potentially preventing recurrence of self-destructive behaviors instead of simply punishing her through incarceration, probably only exacerbating underlying psychological problems without providing therapeutic tools necessary to develop healthier mechanisms for dealing with chronic loneliness and emotional void, apparently motivating initial development of gambling addiction as form of destructive escapism. Final judicial hearing for agreement formalization happened on sunny December morning, approximately 9 months after that transformative Tuesday, when red envelope from credit card company had arrived initiating that entire impossible saga of progressive discoveries about complete extent of maternal betrayals systematically perpetrated for months, while I naively maintained residual trust in basic integrity of person who should have been protective figure. Seeing Vera formally declaring herself guilty before judge and especially hearing her pronounce official words acknowledging responsibility for crimes she'd deliberately committed against me brought strange sensation of partial closure. Even recognizing maternal relationship was irreparably destroyed beyond any realistic possibility of genuine reconciliation based on restored trust or authentic forgiveness, transcending superficial formalities maintained only from inevitable social obligations. The months following that final judicial sentence were a period of gradual reconstruction focused primarily on restoring my credit reputation through long and frustrating bureaucratic process of formally contesting all fraudulent negative marks registered in my tax record by multiple financial institutions, having provided credit based on technically valid documentation presented by Vera during in-person applications. Dr. Sandra, 50-year-old specialist attorney in consumer law Rodrigo, had recommended to assist me specifically with that technical case aspect, worked tirelessly contacting each bank and finance company individually, presenting copies of judicial sentence confirming I'd been fraud victim instead of voluntary participant in criminal schemes, and especially negotiating expedited removal of all negative marks, without need to await conclusion of standard administrative processes, normally taking between 6 and 9 months until final resolution. During that period of systematic cleaning of my credit history stained by others' crimes, I maintained strictly professional and distant relationship with Vera, limited to occasional communications through short messages informing about progress of bank contestations and especially about monthly amounts she was paying as established in judicially agreed restitution plan. Alberto, my 58-year-old paternal uncle, always maintaining close relationship with both daughters after traumatic divorce of my parents decades ago, tried mediating emotional reconciliation between me and Vera through phone conversations where he argued life was too short to maintain permanent family resentments, and I should consider forgiving mistakes committed by elderly person facing loneliness and psychological dependency instead of maintaining cold distance, only causing additional suffering for all involved without providing tangible benefits, compensating emotional costs of permanently broken family relationships. But despite Alberto's well-intentioned appeals about importance of forgiveness and family reconciliation, I firmly maintained position maternal relationship with Vera was definitively terminated beyond minimal formalities necessary to process remaining legal matters related to restitution plan, and especially to maintain basic communications about her health as she aged, facing natural physical ailments, eventually requiring decisions about medical care, where I'd be consulted as older daughter, due to Patricia living too far away to assume practical daily supervision responsibilities. Decision not to seek genuine emotional reconciliation with Vera wasn't motivated by desire for continued punishment or psychological incapacity to process forgiveness, but rather by realistic recognition, trust fundamentally destroyed through calculated betrayals, systematically perpetrated for months couldn't be authentically restored through superficial conversations or symbolic gestures of remorse, not changing historical fact she'd consciously chosen to victimize me, instead of seeking legitimate alternatives to resolve financial problems resulting from destructive addiction. She'd concealed for years while maintaining appearance of maternal respectability. 3 years have passed since that transformative Tuesday, when red envelope arrived detonating emotional bomb at center of my organized life. And during that substantial period, I gradually managed to rebuild financial stability through careful resource management, and especially through renewed focus on professional career prospering significantly, after I could finally dedicate mental energy fully to work instead of constantly processing anxieties related to legal proceedings and bureaucratic battles to clean credit reputation stained by others' crimes. The most important lesson I learned through that devastating experience was recognition. Family relationships don't automatically guarantee trustworthiness or moral integrity of involved people, and appropriate vigilance over personal financial information doesn't represent unjustified paranoia, but rather reasonable protection against potential exploitation, even by people theoretically trustworthy, due to blood ties or shared histories. Today, I maintain obsessive monitoring of my credit history, consulting multiple services weekly to immediately detect any suspicious activity. Implemented 2. Factor authentication on absolutely all financial accounts and especially established automatic alerts, instantly notifying about any credit inquiry made in my name by financial institutions, considering credit applications I didn't personally initiate. Vera continues living alone in modest house fulfilling judicial sentence terms, including mandatory treatment for gambling dependency and symbolic monthly restitution plan payments. But our relationship remains strictly formal, limited to occasional communications about practical matters, without any attempt to rebuild emotional closeness, superficially existing for decades before devastating revelations about her true nature as person, capable of systematically betraying own daughter, financing destructive addiction through cynical exploitation of maternal relationship, and especially of naive trust about family integrity I'd maintained during 39 years of existence based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about character of close people. Did you enjoy Carolina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, And there's another story waiting for you here on screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.